On the last Friday morning of April, the spray truck did not simply stop at the gate of Martha Whitaker's strawberry farm. It hissed, idled, and waited with a full tank already mixed for 80 acres of berries. The driver had serviced 6 farms before breakfast. Every grower along that county road had ordered the same protective spray that week because the signs were already there. Aphids were curling beneath new leaves. Thrips were hiding in blossoms. Extension warnings had gone out about gray mold after a run of cold rain. In Oregon's Willamette Valley, no one waited for insects and disease to become a disaster. Farmers sprayed early, sprayed on schedule, and prayed the crop would survive long enough to pay what it owed. Martha Whitaker stood in the gravel driveway with mud on her boots, a faded canvas jacket over her shoulders, and a folded bank notice in her coat pocket. Behind her stretched 80 acres of strawberries that did not look strong enough for a gamble. The weaker blocks had pale leaves. The soil between the beds was gray and tired. Near the south fence, several plants already showed curled growth and stunted runners. The previous harvest had not covered costs. The bank had given her one more season. Everyone in the valley knew it. The driver climbed down from the cab and handed her the work order. The spray had been booked weeks earlier, when Martha still seemed like a woman trying to farm the way her father had farmed. The driver pointed to the line where she needed to sign before he opened the booms. Martha read the paper once. Then she turned it over and wrote a single sentence across the back. No full-field pesticide application this season. For a moment, the only sound was the engine running beside the rows. The driver looked at the paper, then at the field behind her. The tank was ready. The weather window was good. The pests were already moving. A refusal meant the whole farm would be exposed at the worst possible time. Martha folded the paper and handed it back with the calm expression of someone who understood exactly what the decision could cost. By noon, the story had moved through the valley faster than rainwater through a drainage ditch. Martha Whitaker had sent the spray truck away. Not because the field was clean, not because the crop was safe, not because she had money to lose. She had refused the spray when her plants were weak, her debt was overdue, and her neighbors were certain one bad outbreak would finish the farm. At the feed store, farmers shook their heads over coffee. Along the road, pickup trucks slowed so drivers could stare at her rows. The local chemical dealer called it the most expensive mistake he had seen in years. Some people said grief had finally gotten to her. Others said desperation made farmers believe foolish things when the bank was closing in. What Martha did that afternoon made her look even more ridiculous. Instead of ordering another treatment, she carried trays of tiny alyssum seedlings into the south block and began planting flowers beside the strawberry rows. Over the next week, she added yarrow, dill, clover, and narrow strips of native blooming plants. She spread straw between rows where most growers preferred clean, bare soil. She set sticky cards near the blossoms, marked pest hotspots with colored flags, and walked the field with a hand lens before sunrise. From the road, it looked like an old woman decorating a failing farm. To the bank, it looked irresponsible. To the valley, it looked as if Martha Whitaker had just signed away the last thing her father had left her. But 3 years later, those same neighbors would stand at the edge of that same field and wonder why her strawberry plants stayed green while theirs were under pressure. They would pull back the straw beneath the rows and stare at soil that had turned darker and softer than anyone remembered. They would look at the little flower strips they had once mocked and ask how the pests had stopped taking over her crop. The Whitaker farm sat west of Salem, where the Willamette Valley opens into long berry fields, low hills, and mornings that smell of wet soil and cut grass. It was not the kind of farm people photographed for magazines. There was no painted welcome sign, no tasting room, no white barn for weddings. It was a working place, built from patched irrigation lines, second-hand equipment, repaired crates, and the kind of family pride that could survive poverty better than surrender. Martha had never planned to inherit it. Her father, Samuel Whitaker, had grown strawberries there most of his life. He knew the valley's weather by instinct. He could step outside before dawn, feel the air on his face, and know whether fog would hold long enough to invite disease. When Martha was a child, the farm had been alive in ways she did not yet understand. Bees moved through the rows in spring. Earthworms twisted under old straw. Birds nested in the hedgerows. Customers from town drove out on summer weekends to buy flats of berries from a folding table near the barn. Those years did not disappear all at once. They faded by inches. The buyers became stricter. Labor became harder to find. Fuel rose, fertilizer rose, packaging rose, and every year seemed to demand more spending before the first berry was picked. The plants needed more help to produce the same crop. The soil between rows grew paler and harder. Heavy rain ran across the surface instead of soaking in. Hot weeks in July stressed the plants quickly. Each pest outbreak seemed worse than the last, and each answer came in a jug, a bag, a bill, or a loan. Samuel kept going, because farmers often keep going long after the numbers tell them to stop. He borrowed to repair irrigation. He signed supply contracts that looked manageable in winter and punishing by harvest. He followed spray recommendations because the risk of not spraying seemed greater than the cost of doing it. He did what the valley considered responsible, and for a while, responsibility looked enough like survival. Then one November morning, he collapsed in the equipment shed and never came back inside. After the funeral, Martha returned from Eugene and found the farm's real condition waiting in folders on the kitchen table. There were past due equipment payments. There was an operating loan secured against the land. There were invoices for fertilizer, pesticide, fuel, repairs, labor, trays, packaging, and trucking. There was an irrigation system losing pressure in the north block. There were fields that still looked beautiful from the road, but weak up close. There were buyers who liked the Whitaker name, but no longer trusted the consistency of its fruit. Her brother wanted her to sell before the bank forced the matter. Her grown son, living 2 states away with children of his own, believed the farm had already taken enough from the family. Neighbors were kind, but their kindness had the softness of people preparing themselves to watch a familiar place disappear. They suggested leasing the ground to a larger grower. They mentioned a processor that had been buying land nearby. They told Martha that no one would blame her for letting go. She understood them. She was 57 years old. Her husband had died years before, leaving her used to loneliness, but not immune to fear. She had worked as a school cafeteria manager, not as the owner of an 80-acre berry operation. She knew farming from childhood chores and harvest seasons, from her father's voice and her own muscle memory, but memory was not a business plan. Memory did not pay a banknote. Memory did not stop aphids from multiplying under wet spring leaves. The first season after Samuel's death nearly ended everything. Martha followed the standard program because everyone told her there was no room for experiment. When early disease warnings came, she sprayed. When aphids appeared, she sprayed. When thrips threatened blossoms, she sprayed again. The field survived, but it did not thrive. Gray mold moved through the densest canopy after rain. Hot weather stressed the dry corners. Some fruit softened before it reached the buyer. Some flats were downgraded. A few shipments were rejected outright. At the end of harvest, the checks were not enough. That winter, Martha sat at the kitchen table where her father had once sharpened knives and sorted receipts. She went through the books until late into the night. The pattern was worse than debt. The farm had become dependent on rescue. Every weakness demanded a product. Every product demanded cash. Every season began with borrowed money and ended with the land slightly more tired than before. Martha began reading because sleep no longer came easily. She read university extension papers, soil biology guides, grower trial reports, and case studies on integrated pest management. She learned that pest control was not supposed to mean killing every insect on a calendar. It meant scouting, measuring pressure, understanding economic thresholds, protecting beneficial insects, improving crop health, and intervening only when a pest population threatened real loss. She learned that aphids could be suppressed by lady beetles, lacewing larvae, hoverflies, and parasitic wasps if those insects had nectar, shelter, and time to build. She learned that thrips could be monitored with sticky cards instead of guessed at from panic. She learned that gray mold, or botrytis, often exploded when dense plant canopies stayed wet overnight. She learned that bare soil could worsen plant stress by heating quickly, shedding water, splashing disease spores during rain, and offering no refuge for predators. None of it sounded easy. It did not promise a field free from pests. It did not promise a harvest without loss. It did not promise that a bank officer would understand why a woman in debt wanted to plant flowers instead of buy more chemicals. What it suggested was slower and more demanding. It suggested that Martha's farm was not failing only because pests were too strong. It was failing because the system around the strawberries had become too weak to resist them. By late winter, Martha had formed a plan that sounded like foolishness when spoken aloud. She would not continue the full-field broad pesticide program her farm had depended on. She would divide the 80 acres into management blocks. She would scout leaves and blossoms twice a week, more often during high-risk weather. She would use sticky cards to track thrips, leaf sampling to count aphid colonies, and written thresholds to decide when action was truly needed. She would plant insectary strips of alyssum, yarrow, dill, clover, and native flowering plants close enough to pest hotspots for beneficial insects to matter. She would use straw mulch to reduce soil splash, hold moisture, and protect shallow roots from heat stress. She would repair irrigation, water in the morning to shorten leaf wetness, open dense canopies to reduce botrytis, and use spot treatments only where monitoring showed real danger. It was not a refusal to manage the farm. It was a refusal to manage it blindly. The valley did not see the difference. The chemical dealer warned her that beneficial insects would not pay her loan. A neighbor who had grown berries for 30 years said she was confusing backyard gardening with commercial agriculture. A buyer told her cosmetic damage could destroy her market before she had time to explain her philosophy. Her bank officer listened to the plan with the careful expression of a man trying not to insult a customer whose collateral might soon belong to his employer. Even people who loved her were frightened. Her brother believed she was risking family land to prove a point. Her son worried she was trying to save Samuel's memory instead of making a practical decision. Seasonal workers watched with uncertainty as Martha marked flags in the field and explained that their work would include scouting, planting, mowing, pruning, and recording, not simply waiting for a spray schedule. Martha did not argue. She knew the plan sounded strange. She knew one severe outbreak could ruin the crop. She knew the old way had experts, suppliers, invoices, and routines behind it, while her way had notebooks, flowers, and faith in processes too small to see from the road. But the old way had not saved the farm. It had only made the farm more expensive to keep failing. In March, she started. The first mistake came quickly. Martha planted her longest flower strip along the outer edge of the south block because it looked neat and made sense on paper. The alyssum bloomed, the yarrow established, and the dill came up fine. But when aphids appeared inside the field, the beneficial insects were too far away to respond quickly. Hotspots formed 30 and 40 rows from the edge. The predators were present, but not where she needed them. The second mistake came from clover. She had read that clover could protect soil and support beneficial insects. What she learned in the field was that clover managed poorly could compete with weak strawberry plants for water and light. In the north block, where the soil was shallow and compacted, the clover grew fast, while the strawberries struggled. A neighbor driving by saw the green alleys and joked that Martha was raising weeds better than berries. The third mistake came after rain. Straw mulch helped hold moisture, but in a few low spots, Martha laid it too thick. The canopy stayed damp. Botrytis found those areas after a cold, wet week and turned clusters of ripening fruit gray. She had tried to protect the crop and had accidentally created a pocket where disease felt protected too. By June, parts of the field looked worse than anyone had predicted. Aphids curled leaves along the interior rows. Thrips scarred blossoms in the western block. Gray mold damaged fruit in the low areas. Some strawberry plants near the south fence produced so poorly that the berries were worth more as processing fruit than fresh market flats. The harvest did not collapse entirely. But it disappointed at exactly the moment Martha needed proof. The bank sent another notice. Martha carried it into the house, opened it at the kitchen table, and placed it under the sugar bowl, where she would not have to see it every time she passed. That night, the spray company's number sat beside the phone. By morning, the phone had not been touched. Martha went back to the field before sunrise because doubt did not change the work that needed doing. She moved slowly through the rows with a hand lens and a notebook. In the places where aphids had been worst, she began seeing swollen brown aphid shells, signs that parasitic wasps had laid eggs inside them. Near the alyssum, hoverflies hung in the air over the blossoms. On several leaves, lacewing eggs rose on tiny stalks, like white threads. Lady beetle larvae, black and orange and almost ugly enough to be mistaken for pests, moved through colonies of aphids and fed. The system had not failed because it was imaginary. It had failed because Martha had built it too weakly, too neatly, and too far from the problem. That realization changed the second season. She stopped thinking in pretty borders and started thinking in corridors, islands, and timing. Instead of one long flower strip at the edge, she planted smaller insectary strips inside the field, close to the rows where aphids had appeared first. She staggered bloom periods so nectar would be present before pest pressure peaked, not after. She left some grasses for ground beetles but mowed them before they shaded the berries. She managed clover like a tool, not a decoration, cutting it low in weak blocks and removing it where competition outweighed benefit. She improved monitoring. Sticky cards went into the western block before bloom to track thrips. She counted aphid colonies on marked leaves instead of judging by fear. She recorded whether predators were present before deciding on intervention. When numbers crossed her threshold in one interior pocket, she used a limited spot treatment rather than spraying all 80 acres. In the dry corners, where mites threatened to build, she corrected irrigation coverage and released predatory mites only where scouting justified it. The second year still punished her. A cold spring slowed the flowers. A hot June pushed mites in the driest beds. One worker quit because the scouting felt tedious and the pay was no higher than easier field labor nearby. Martha sold her late husband's old pickup to cover payroll and irrigation parts, sitting in the cab for several minutes before handing over the keys, because some losses were not financial, even when money forced them. But the field began to answer in measurable ways. The straw-covered rows stayed cooler through hot afternoons. Water soaked in better where compost and mulch had softened the surface. The fruit from the north block held firmness longer after harvest. Aphid outbreaks still happened, but they spread more slowly where flower islands were nearby. Thrips damage still appeared, but sticky card counts gave Martha warning before panic could make decisions for her. Botrytis still found damp corners, but morning irrigation and canopy thinning reduced the wet hours that had once invited it. Her pesticide bill fell. Her labor hours rose. The farm did not become easier, it became more honest. Instead of paying for broad protection and discovering later whether it had worked, Martha was learning where the danger was, when it mattered, and what kind of response fit the size of the threat. The valley remained unconvinced. From the road, her farm looked less disciplined than the bare fields around it. There were flower strips where other farmers had clean lanes. There was straw where others had exposed soil. There were flags, cards, and patchy clover that looked like indecision to anyone measuring skill by tidiness. People saw the mess before they saw the method. Martha's notebook saw more. It held block maps, pest counts, bloom dates, predator sightings, disease notes, soil moisture observations, rejection rates, buyer comments, labor costs, pesticide receipts, and harvest weights. It showed that the worst damage was narrowing into fewer areas. It showed that beneficial insects arrived earlier where habitat remained through the season. It showed that the soil under mulch held water longer and that fruit from those blocks softened less quickly in heat. The third spring brought the kind of weather that exposes weak systems. Warm days arrived early, pushing growth ahead. Then cold rain settled over the valley. Blossoms opened unevenly. Disease warnings came again. Several neighboring growers sprayed aggressively because they remembered how quickly botrytis could ruin a field. Martha increased scouting instead of abandoning her plan. She pruned old leaves from dense rows, removed infected fruit before spores spread, shifted irrigation earlier, and watched the forecast hour by hour. Where disease pressure crossed her limit, she treated specific blocks. Where it did not, she left the predators and pollinators undisturbed. That season, her farm began to look different, even to people who did not want it to. The strawberry leaves were darker. The plants recovered faster after heat. The soil beneath the straw no longer broke into hard plates when dry. In the south block, once her worst aphid zone, hoverflies arrived before colonies exploded. In the western block, sticky card counts showed thrips pressure rising, but not blindly. Martha adjusted her response before damage spread through the blossoms. In the low corner where gray mold had embarrassed her the first year, better airflow and thinner mulch kept losses manageable. Then the valley's real test arrived. A warm, dry spell in early summer caused aphids, thrips, and mites to surge across several farms at once. Growers who had followed their usual schedule still found hotspots spreading through fields. Some sprayed again, others called consultants. At the feed store, conversations grew tense because every extra pass through the field meant more money spent before harvest money came in. People expected Martha's farm to collapse first. Instead, her pests rose and leveled. Aphids appeared in the interior rows, but lady beetle larvae and parasitic wasps were already present. Thrips damaged some blossoms, but scouting caught the increase before it became a field-wide problem. Mites built in a dry corner, then remained contained after irrigation correction and a localized predator release. The field was not pest-free. That was the part experts noticed later. It was something more useful than pest-free. It was balanced enough that pests had trouble becoming disasters. The harvest did not break a world record. It did something more important. It paid the bills. The berries were firmer than the year before. Rejection rates dropped. The North Block produced its best fresh market yield since Samuel's final good season. Chemical costs were far lower than in the old program, and while scouting and habitat management took more labor, the total cost of crisis response fell. Buyers noticed the fruit held better during transport. A regional grocer that had once hesitated over the Whitaker account asked whether Martha could supply a larger order the following season. The bank did not praise her. Banks rarely praise farmers. But the tone of the letters changed. The next meeting was no longer about foreclosure. It was about restructuring. For Martha, that was victory enough to sleep through the night for the first time in years. The neighbors began by slowing down at the gate. No one arrived with an apology. The first visits were practical, guarded, almost accidental. A grower from the east stopped to ask what she had planted along the south block. Another wanted to know whether the yellow sticky cards actually told her anything useful. A third had mite damage in his own dry corner and wondered why hers had not spread. They did not say they had been wrong. They asked questions, and for farmers, questions can be the first crack in certainty. Martha answered with records, not speeches. She showed them the maps from the first failed year, when her flowers had been too far from the aphid hotspots. She showed them clover notes from the block where cover became competition. She showed them botrytis losses from the low area, where too much straw had held moisture. She showed the improved layout, the mowing dates, the sticky card counts, the leaf samples, the predator observations, and the limited treatment records. The lesson was clear without being said too loudly. Her field had not improved because she believed harder. It improved because she paid attention, measured, failed, adjusted, and kept measuring. A university extension specialist from Oregon State visited after hearing about the farm through a buyer. She arrived expecting a small local curiosity and found 5 notebooks stacked on Martha's kitchen table. The records were not polished, but they were detailed. Each block had its history. Each change had a reason. Each result had a number beside it. The specialist walked the rows, examined the insectary strips, checked the mulch, looked beneath leaves, and asked for copies of Martha's maps. Later that summer, a small field day was held at the Whitaker farm. Martha disliked being treated as an expert. She did not stand on a platform. She walked ahead of the group in work boots, stopping where the ground itself could explain. At the south block, she showed where the first attempt had failed. At the west rows, she pointed to sticky cards and explained how thrips pressure could be watched before blossoms were ruined. Near the low corner, she pulled back straw and showed how disease management depended on airflow and moisture as much as any product. At the clover alleys, she showed the difference between cover that helped and cover that competed. People listened because the farm around them made the words difficult to dismiss. By the 5th year, the Whitaker farm had become one of the most talked about berry operations in that part of the valley, though it still looked modest to anyone expecting success to shine. The barn roof was patched, not new. The tractor still smoked on cold mornings. Martha still reused trays longer than she should have, but the fields had changed. In spring, alyssum bloomed low and white between selected rows. Yarrow and dill lifted taller flowers near the block edges. Clover protected soil where it belonged and disappeared where it did not. Native plants along the hedgerows fed insects before the strawberry blossoms opened. Straw mulch lay in a thinner, better-managed layer than in the early years. The irrigation system no longer leaked pressure across half the north block. Water entered the soil instead of racing across it. Earthworms appeared where the ground had once been hard and lifeless. The farm's success came in layers. First, the soil held moisture longer. Then the plants recovered faster from heat. Then fruit firmness improved. Then rejection rates dropped. Then the pesticide bill stopped being the largest symbol of fear in the farm office. Then buyers began calling before Martha had to call them. The change was slow enough to be believable and steady enough to be undeniable. The east neighbor, the same man who had once joked that Martha was raising weeds better than berries, planted a narrow insectary strip along his worst aphid block. He did not copy her whole system. He started with one strip, one set of sticky cards, and one threshold chart. Another grower tried straw mulch in a dry field and found his plants held through heat with less stress. A third began scouting before spraying and discovered that some insect spikes did not require a full field response. Martha took no pleasure in having been mocked first. She had spent too many nights afraid to turn vindication into entertainment. She knew every farmer who had laughed at her was also carrying debt, weather risk, labor problems, and the private terror of losing land their families had worked for generations. They had not laughed because they were evil. They had laughed because the old way felt safer, and fear often disguises itself as common sense. When younger farmers came to visit, Martha showed them failure before success. She showed them the South Block maps from year 1. She showed the clover mistake. She showed the mold losses. She showed the receipt from the season when she had sold her husband's pickup to keep workers paid. She wanted them to understand that changing a farm did not mean escaping hardship. It meant accepting a different kind of work, one that demanded closer observation and punished lazy optimism. Her granddaughter Emily returned after college with training in agricultural ecology and a laptop full of tools Martha had never used. Emily installed moisture sensors, digitized scouting maps, and helped compare multi-year trends by block. But she kept Martha's handwritten notebooks on a shelf near the kitchen window. The pages were stained, bent, and crowded with ordinary observations that had become part of the farm's inheritance. Aphids first seen near south fence, May 14th. Hoverflies active in alyssum, May 22nd. Clover too aggressive in weak rows. Morning irrigation reduced leaf wetness. Lady beetle larvae present before outbreak peaked. Botrytis lower where canopy opened early. Those notes mattered because they were not theories floating above the land. They were proof that someone had stayed long enough to notice. Under Emily's care, the farm did not freeze itself in Martha's methods. It kept adapting. Some flower mixes changed. Some blocks used different cover crops. New monitoring tools replaced old cards in places. But the principle remained. The farm would not return to panic as its main management strategy. It would watch first, strengthen the system, and intervene with precision when intervention was truly needed. By then, the story of the morning Martha turned away the spray truck had become local legend. People told it as if she had been fearless. They made it sound like she had stood at the gate already knowing the field would prove everyone wrong. Martha always disliked that version. It was too clean. It turned patience into prophecy and made courage seem easier than it had been. The truth was simpler and harder. She had been afraid when she refused the spray. She had known the pests were real. She had known the bank would not forgive a failed harvest because her intentions were thoughtful. She had known the valley would laugh. She had stood there anyway because the farm was already dying by inches, and she could not keep buying the same answer while the soil grew weaker beneath her feet. In her later years, Martha spent less time lifting crates and more time walking the field edges. She moved slowly, but she still noticed what others missed. The first hoverflies in spring, the smell of damp straw after rain, the difference between soil that merely looked wet and soil that had truly absorbed water, the way a healthy strawberry plant lifted its leaves after a cool night, the tiny openings earthworms left behind in ground that had once shed rain like a roof. She did not become wealthy in the way outsiders imagine successful farmers become wealthy. The farm still depended on weather. Labor still cost more each year. Markets still shifted. Equipment still broke at the worst time. But the Whitaker farm was no longer fragile in the same way. It had room to breathe. It had soil that could hold water, insects that could check other insects, plants that could recover, and records that could guide the next decision. One June morning, years after the spray truck turned around at the gate, Martha watched a group of young farmers kneel in the south block. They were not looking at the berries first. They were looking beneath the leaves, along the mulch line, into the flowers, at the small movement of predators among pests. They were looking at the whole field instead of only the crop. That was the moment Martha understood what the farm had truly saved. It had saved more than land. It had saved a way of seeing. The little white flowers still bloomed every spring along the rows where everyone had once expected failure. They were never magic. They were not a trick. They were the first visible sign of a deeper decision, to stop treating the farm as a battlefield where every living thing had to be defeated, and to start treating it as a living system that could become strong again if someone was patient enough to learn its language. The laughter faded. The debt shrank. The soil darkened. The berries grew firm and sweet again. And the question that had once sounded like mockery became the question visitors asked with notebooks in their hands. How did she know this would work? Martha never answered that question the way people wanted. She had not known. She had watched. She had failed. She had corrected. She had waited. She had trusted evidence more than pride, and patience more than panic. What the valley once called foolish became, one row at a time, a method. What looked like weeds from the road became habitat. What looked like hesitation became precision. What looked like an old woman refusing help became a farmer brave enough to stop repeating a solution that was slowly weakening her land. The world often laughs at what it does not yet understand, but sometimes, inside the thing everyone calls foolish, there is a wiser future waiting for someone patient enough to grow it.